This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
Thank you for tuning into the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Noah Dunlap, and I want to open the show today by wishing all of you fantastic Fridays, wherever you find yourself. If you're here in this great country, I hope you're having a fantastic Friday. If you find yourself overseas, somewhere else, same thing. I hope you are all having a fantastic Friday with whatever y'all are doing. Thank you guys for tuning in today. Got a lot to get to today. Sports never stops. Other industries might. Sports don't. Gonna start off by breaking down the NFL draft today. As we know, the NFL draft took place last weekend. Haven't broken that down yet. Gonna look at some of the surprises and what you can expect moving forward with the NFL season coming up later this fall. After that, want to look at the NBA playoff picture. The NBA playoffs start here in the next week and a half or so. What you can expect from the NBA playoffs, what you can expect with the new play-in tournament. They did it last year in the bubble. They're doing it this time outside of the bubble. So what you can look forward to with the play-in tournament coming up. Segment 3 coming up later on. Going to look at a bit of an obscure topic with the NCAA and the college baseball and college softball tournaments that are coming up. The NCAA made some new announcements regarding their spring championships and the way that they were going to be conducted. So we'll look at that. They've gotten a bit of controversy and backlash for it. We'll dive into that. And then coming up in the last segment today, going to look at the top 10 quarterbacks taken in this year's NFL draft, and I'm going to break them down 10-1 for y'all. So got a lot to get to. With that being said, let's go ahead and dive in. The NFL draft took place last weekend, started last Thursday night, as we all know. And the first 2 picks came as no surprise to anyone. You had Trevor Lawrence going number 1 overall to the Jacksonville Jaguars, and you had Zach Wilson going number 2 to the New York Jets. Both of those were pretty much locked in stone months ago. The third pick is where things kind of got a little crazy, and I was surprised with the third pick. San Francisco, the 49ers, decided to go with Trey Lance, the quarterback from North Dakota State, with the third pick in the draft. That caught me off guard. I know the odds markets had all 3 different quarterbacks. You had Mac Jones, Justin Fields, and Trey Lance ahead in terms of the favorite to be taken with that 3 pick at different times. Trey Lance moved ahead on Thursday, and the money was right as the 49ers took Trey Lance with the number 3 pick. I don't know that that's where I would have gone. I think I would have leaned hard into, I think, Mac Jones. You could certainly make an argument for Justin Fields. I think Justin Fields is going to be a really solid NFL quarterback as well. But with that pick, I think the risk-reward would have been better by taking Mac Jones there. But we'll see how that works out for the 49ers and Kyle Shanahan with Trey Lance under center now moving forward. With the 4 pick, the Falcons came out and took Kyle Pitts, the tight end / receiver from the University of Florida. No surprise there. Matt Ryan, I think Matt Ryan is going to be okay. He has probably 2 or 3 years left, I would say, in Atlanta playing pretty good football. So I'm glad Atlanta moved away from the thought of taking a quarterback there. It would have been easy for Atlanta to take a quarterback and just try to move away from Matt Ryan. I don't think that's the right move. I think when you have a quarterback who has shown the ability to play at a high level, who can still play at a high level for the next 2 or 3 years, I like the idea of the Falcons deciding to move in and bringing in another weapon. When you look at what the Falcons now have on offense, you have Matt Ryan under center, you have Kyle Pitts playing tight end, and your 2 wideouts, you have Calvin Ridley and Julio Jones. That's an offense that's going to put up points. And I'm really excited to watch the Falcons this year, which hasn't really been something you've been able to say over the past couple of years. So excited to see what the Falcons can do. Glad that they decided to go Kyle Pitts there instead of trying to force their hand with a quarterback and trying to move Matt Ryan out. With the 5 pick, I was also extremely surprised by the Bengals move there. The Bengals just drafted Joe Burrow, number 1 overall last year. And Burrow showed glimpses of being a really good Pro Bowl level quarterback in the NFL, except for the fact that he got hurt roughly halfway through the season because the Bengals offensive line was just so bad. Which is why when you look at the draft and you look at the draft boards, you had Penei Sewell, the offensive lineman from Oregon, who may be the overall best player in regards of, well, in terms of prospects that this draft had. Everyone agrees that Trevor Lawrence was going number 1. Everyone virtually agrees that Trevor Lawrence was the best quarterback in the draft. And as we know, quarterback is the most important position on the field in the NFL, which is why we're going to break down the top 10 quarterbacks in the last segment today. But in regards to just overall talent and regardless of position, I think Penei Sewell may have been the best player in the draft. So when you have a talent like that and you have a need, if you're the Cincinnati Bengals, to shore up your offensive line just a little bit, it seems bizarre that they decided to go with Jamar Chase, the receiver out of LSU, instead of trying to fix up the offensive line. Now, I understand that Burrow has already played with Jamar Chase at LSU. You're comfortable with Jamar Chase. The problem is it doesn't matter who I have on the outside if I don't have time to get the ball out. That's the issue that you saw with Joe Burrow this year before he got injured, and I think that's going to be the issue moving forward with the Cincinnati Bengals. So I'm not a huge fan of the Bengals move there at 5. 6, the Miami Dolphins. I like Jalen Waddle a lot. They went with Jalen Waddle, the wide receiver from the University of Alabama. I do like Jalen Waddle a lot, except I think the risk factor there may be a tad bit too high for me to take him at 6. He's coming off of a nasty ankle injury that ended his season and then didn't end his season as he came out and played in the national title game just a little bit, played a couple of snaps, had a huge 3rd down conversion early on. But Devontae Smith was out there. If the Dolphins were just looking purely at wide receiver, I think Devontae Smith, the Heisman Trophy winner and the co-star wide receiver at the University of Alabama, would have been a safer bet. The questions with Devontae Smith were clearly his size. He's not a very big guy, but the talent is there, the speed is there, and more importantly, the wingspan. DeVonta Smith does not drop many balls, and his arms are so long, he's so athletic that I think he's going to be fine even being a bit smaller than your average NFL receiver. So if I were the Dolphins, I think I would have leaned heavily into having DeVonta Smith there at 6. They decided to go a different way, and I guess that's fine. The Detroit Lions, I think, had quietly had a really nice first round as Penei Sewell ended up dropping into their laps. Not exactly sure how that ended up happening, as, like I've said before, I thought Penei Sewell was going to go at 5, potentially higher if you're just talking talent level, regardless of position. So the fact that he managed to drop all the way down to 7 was a big move for the Detroit Lions. Moving on away from the Detroit Lions, a few of the other surprises coming out of the first round of the draft. J.C. Horn, cornerback from South Carolina, going 8 as the first defensive player taken. Wasn't so sure about that move. I thought Patrick Surtain should have been the first defender taken in the draft. I'm a huge believer in Patrick Surtain coming out of Alabama. He was the biggest factor in terms of the Alabama defense this year. Dylan Moses at linebacker had a lot to say about that, but Patrick Surtain out wide for Alabama was just a complete animal. He was a monster this year. So I feel like I would have gone Surtain if I were the Carolina Panthers at 8. They decided to go J.C. Horn. That's fine. The Broncos taking Surtain at 9, however, what that shows is that the Denver Broncos clearly plan on getting involved in the Aaron Rodgers sweepstakes, and I don't blame them. The Broncos don't really have a quarterback right now, and the rest of their roster is pretty solid. I like the Denver Broncos roster a lot, but if you're dealing with a below-average quarterback, I don't know that it matters how good your roster is. So I think with the Broncos deciding to shy away from the quarterbacks that were still on the board at 9, what that signifies is that they fully think they have a real chance at coming out and trading for Aaron Rodgers. That's a great plan as long as you don't miss. If you end up going into the season and you didn't draft a quarterback because you thought you were getting Aaron Rodgers and it doesn't work out, I don't know what to tell you if you're John Elway, the GM of the Denver Broncos. He's going to have questions to answer. So here's to hoping that he ended up winning one here and that Rodgers may end up in Denver. I'm not a huge believer in that idea, but apparently John Elway is. DeVonta Smith going at 10. Already broke down how I felt about DeVonta Smith. Justin Fields, quarterback from Ohio State, going to Chicago at 11. I like that move. Like I said, I think Justin Fields is going to be a really solid NFL quarterback. The Cowboys at 12 taking Micah Parsons. Micah Parsons may be one of the best defenders I've ever seen in terms of looking NFL ready in college. The question is whether the off-the-field issues and questions surrounding Micah Parsons can tone down as he enters the league. If they can, Micah Parsons at 12 is a great pickup for the Dallas Cowboys. If they can't, I'm not sure that it's going to end up being a great move. Mac Jones down at 15, falling into Bill Belichick's lap down at 15. Interesting to see how that plays out. A few of the other surprises of the first round. Alex Leatherwood, the offensive tackle from Alabama, going 17 to the Las Vegas Raiders. Virtually no one had Alex Leatherwood in the top 40 of their prospects, and the Raiders coming out doing Raider-type things by drafting a guy who would have still been there absolutely in the second round, potentially down in the third round with their first round pick instead. It's what the Raiders do. I guess we'll see if it works out. I'm not really optimistic, but hey, who knows? A few of the other moves of the first round. Najee Harris, running back from Alabama, going to Pittsburgh, down at 24. Do not sleep on Najee Harris. Even if you haven't watched much college football over the past 2 years, Najee Harris is a grown man, and a lot of the times in SEC play, he simply looked like a man amongst boys. The hurdle that he gave in the semifinal against Notre Dame over on the sideline, that he just absolutely hurdled the defender and made the guy look silly. I think you can expect to see that from Najee Harris at the pro level as well. His body, he is already ready for the NFL, and he's going to prove that here in year one. That was really the only kind of surprises or notable picks of the first round to me. As for the second round, once you get out of the first round, you start kind of playing a guessing game, especially once you get out of the second round in regards to who works out and who doesn't. The second round, let's see what we have. Elijah Moore going at 34 to the New York Jets. Elijah Moore is the wide receiver from Ole Miss. Extremely fast, lacking in size, but he's a playmaker. He's a deep threat on every play. He's going to stretch the defense a little bit. Matching him up with Zach Wilson in that New York Jet offense, I like where that can go. I don't know if it's going to work out, but I do like the potential there at least. Other moves of the second round, let's see. The surprises, Terrace Marshall Jr., another wide receiver from LSU, going down at 59 to the Carolina Panthers. Terrace Marshall he's another guy that you expect to go pretty much exactly where he did in the draft. There's still a lot of progress to be made. He needs to develop more in regards to just being a receiver, but the potential is absolutely there when you look at what he did with Joe Burrow, especially 2 years ago down at LSU. This year, it was hit or miss. The quarterbacks down in Baton Rouge this year at LSU, I feel like kind of let the skill positions down just a little bit as your quarterbacks were lacking. But when you look at the LSU team that won the national title 2 years ago, you can't help but not be surprised at the fact and the sheer number of first and second round picks that ended up being on that team. The last surprise that I had coming out of the second round was Kyle Trask, the quarterback from Florida, dropping all the way down to 64 to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Kyle Trask is one of those guys that came on out of nowhere at Florida. He started his career over at Houston, transferred to Florida, sat behind Felipe Franks for a while, and then this year ended up taking off. He showed glimpses last year, and it wasn't until this year that you put up a pretty close to a Heisman Trophy caliber campaign throughout the season that your name took off as being one of those guys. So the issue with Kyle Trask is it's only been 1 year, a year and a half max that you've seen from Kyle Trask. You don't know how much you're going to get from him. Was it a system thing with Dan Mullen being the quarterback? For those of you who don't know, Dan Mullen is also the guy who turned Dak Prescott into an everyday name at Mississippi State. So is it a system thing with Kyle Trask, or is Kyle Trask a legitimate factor in terms of being a quarterback at the next level? I do like the fit. I don't know how successful he's going to be. I like the idea that Kyle Trask is down in Tampa Bay and you get to learn from Tom Brady. Like I said, I don't know how talented he is. He showed glimpses, but a lot of that was going to Kyle Pitts, which it doesn't matter who you are. If you're a quarterback and you have a tight end / a receiver like Kyle Pitts to throw to, I feel like your numbers can be pretty good. So when you're looking at it, it's just one of those things that trying to decide between whether Kyle Trask is going to end up making it at the next level, I'm just not sure about. That's really the gist of what we had in terms of surprises when you talk about the first round, the second round of the NFL draft. After that, when you start getting into rounds 3 through 7, everything turns into a guessing game. You could break down every pick, all 256 of them, I believe there were. You could break them all down and try to decide whether this person or that person's going to make it. In the end, it's impossible. Drafting NFL talent is one of the hardest things to do in the world of sports, knowing whether or not somebody's going to work out. Those were the surprises that we had. Those were the ones that stuck out, and, well, we'll wait until fall, late August, early September. A few of these names that we just listed off will be on the field starting off week 1. Others probably won't be. They'll be sitting on the bench. They'll be learning from veterans in the league, and who knows? For a lot of people, that's probably a better thing. So, a couple months, we'll know more about what we have that came out of this draft. Coming up in segment 2, the NBA postseason is almost upon us. Coming up in the next week and a half, we've got play-in tournaments. We got first round starting off. So in this next segment, we'll be breaking that down and looking at what we have and what we can expect coming up next week.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines, they got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back in. So we ended the last segment by breaking down the NFL draft, mainly the first 2 rounds, and then talking about the fact that once you get out of the first 2 rounds of the NFL draft, it's just a guessing game. Everything is hard. So that's where we were with segment 1. Coming up later on in the show, I'll be breaking down the top 10 quarterbacks that were drafted. By my math, there were only 10 quarterbacks drafted, so I'll be ranking them down 10-1 and explaining my list based on talent level, based on fit, and there are sure to be some surprises in that list. My list is not what you're going to see from everyone else, but before we get to the top 10 quarterbacks, I want to take a look into the NBA postseason playoff standings and what we're looking at as we come down the stretch with roughly a week and a half to go in the NBA season, the NBA regular season anyway. As we know, the NBA has decided to go back in and, much like they did last year in the bubble with the play-in tournament, they are doing the same thing, expanded out just a little bit this year in regards to their playoff structure. The play-in tournament for both conferences this year, it's going to feature the 7 and 8 seeds playing a game, and then the 9 and 10 seeds playing a game. The loser of the 9-10 matchup is done. Their season's over with. The winner will play the loser of the 7-8 matchup, and the winner of the 7-8 matchup ends up being the 7 seed. The loser of that game plays the winner of the 9-10 for the last playoff spot, which would then be the 8 seed. That's going on in both conferences. So now that we know the layout of the play-in tournament and we know how the playoff system works in the NBA, I want to start off with the Eastern Conference and looking at what we have in the Eastern Conference as we come down the home stretch of the regular season. Shocking many, the Philadelphia 76ers are sitting atop the Eastern Conference standings right now at 45-21. They're currently 2.5 up on the Brooklyn Nets. That's surprising to just about everyone. When you look at the Nets and what they did this offseason and early on this season, you hired Steve Nash as your head coach. You brought in Kevin Durant last year, but this is the first year he's playing because he was hurt last year. You brought in Kyrie Irving, who was also there last year, but same thing as KD. He did not play all that much last year. And then early on this season, they brought in James Harden to create and finish up their super team. Now, the question with the Brooklyn Nets is simply going to be whether those guys can play together or not. So far, it's worked out pretty well when they are on the court together. At least two of them on the court together. Their record, they're sitting at, with the second seed in the East right now, they're sitting at 43-24 on the season. And that's without James Harden right now. He's missed, I think it's been a couple weeks now. They expect him to be back in time for the playoffs, which is going to be another huge factor if you're a Brooklyn Nets fan. If you're looking at the Nets to make it deep into the playoffs, potentially making the finals, potentially winning a title, you're going to have all three of those guys healthy. I don't think the backups on that roster, your bench up there in Brooklyn, has enough to overpower some of the teams that they're going to find. It's going to have to come from your three stars in KD, Kyrie, and James Harden. So right now, if you're a Nets fan, I don't think the 1 seed matters all that much to them. When you're looking at it, you just want everyone healthy as you begin your playoff push. Milwaukee, who has been the 1 seed in the East the past 2 years, is sitting down at 3 with Giannis leading the way. Somewhat of a disappointing year for Milwaukee, I think, when you look at it. They're sitting at 42-24 right now. But right now, when you look at where Milwaukee is compared to where they've been in years past, I think it's just one of those where the energy hasn't been there. They look kind of bored, and that's a problem because for other teams, when you look at past teams, you look at the Lakers, if you want to talk about it last year, you look at the Warriors somewhat in years past. There are certain teams who have enough talent that they can just flip that switch when the playoffs come around. And then there are other teams that I don't know that they have the talent that they can just automatically flip that switch when the postseason comes around and they can start playing really solid basketball again. I don't know that you have that up there in Milwaukee. And so the fact that they already seem to be lacking in energy just a little bit creates questions on my end. I'm not a huge fan of that, and I would be a little hesitant if you're talking about potentially betting on Milwaukee to make it deep into the playoffs, if you think Milwaukee has a chance at potentially winning a title. I would be extremely hesitant just because of the questions that are currently out there in regards to the energy, and outside of Giannis, what does Milwaukee actually have? New York, the Knicks, sitting at 4, pleasant surprise for the NBA especially. When you talk about big markets and the just utter futility that has plagued Knicks fans for so long, the fact that they are now sitting at 4th in the East at 37-29, like I said, pleasant surprise. Now, whether or not they can pull off an upset somewhere along the way to suddenly push into the Eastern Conference Finals, maybe farther, we'll see. I don't know about the talent that's there. Clearly, they're playing well together, but the East as a whole is a little down this year. So is it a situation where they are actually that good and that they can make a legitimate push, or is it the fact that they've been playing in a weaker conference against weaker teams and that has allowed them to propel themselves into that 4 spot? The playoffs are going to be fun regardless of how you look at it. Atlanta sitting at 5, Trae Young making an immediate impact in year 2 over in Atlanta. Boston sitting at 6 right now. I think Boston is a sleeper. No one's really talking about the Boston Celtics right now. Remember, they made it to the Eastern Conference Finals last year where they slipped up against the Miami Heat. The talent is still the same in Boston. The question is whether they can get the flip switched in time. You've seen it a little bit from Jason Tatum over the past week or so. When you talk about Boston, you're talking Jason Tatum, you're talking Jaylen Brown, you're talking Brad Stevens, who I think is absolutely one of the best coaches in the NBA. The question with Boston is not talent. The question is whether or not they decide to play together and whether or not they decide to play with the urgency that is going to be needed to actually get the job done. So I think Boston right now is going to be one of the biggest sleepers coming out of the East. I think Boston is going to end up being that team that's going to knock off someone. I could absolutely, assuming the numbers stay where they are, the seedings stay where they are right now, I think I would take Boston over Milwaukee in the first round. I think Boston is that good. So the fact that they're sitting at 3, I think that's just a situation where you're looking at a team that kind of got bored throughout the middle part of the season. They've played a little better lately, so look out for Boston to make noise when it comes to the playoffs. Miami at 7, same thing with Miami. The talent is there. They just haven't played well. And that's the reason they're currently sitting tied with Boston. The Celtics and the Heat are sitting both at 35 and 31 right now. The tiebreaker right now goes to Boston, which would end up with Miami playing in the play-in game in a 1-game deal against Charlotte to potentially end up with the 7 seed. That'll be big. It's a big matchup. 9 and 10 is the Pacers and the Wizards right now. Props to Bradley Beal out there in Washington, D.C., leading the Washington Wizards. Bradley Beal leads the NBA in scoring right now at just a touch under 32 points a game, I believe it is. That goes along with Russell Westbrook as the point guard out there in Washington. That's a team that can make noise because they have the firepower to score on everyone. I don't know that the defense is there, and I think that's going to end up being a problem for the Wizards when it comes down to potentially sneaking into the playoffs as like the 8 seed. But if you let them in, and you let them get there, and you let them get hot, when you have an offense and the firepower, the scoring ability of Russell Westbrook and Bradley Beal together, that's a team that can make noise. So much like the Boston Celtics currently sitting at the 6, I think the fact that the Wizards right now are the 10 seed, I think they win their initial play-in game against the 9 seed in the East, and I could see them playing extremely well against the loser of the 7-8 matchup with the Heat and the Hornets. Look for the Wizards to sneak in as the 8 seed. I don't know that many people have been talking about that yet, but that's where I'm looking at right now when it comes to the Eastern Conference. Flipping across the country to look at the Western Conference now. Utah is holding steady as the 1 seed out west. That's also been a pleasant surprise all year long. The fact that Utah has basically been the 1 seed out west for the entire year. In terms of the Western Conference, everyone coming into the year, you immediately threw money down on the LA teams, whether it was the Clippers, whether it was the Lakers. Those were just the two. And instead, where you're looking right now in regards to the Western Conference is the Utah Jazz leading the way, and they've been leading the way all year long. And the Phoenix Suns sitting at the 2. I don't know where the Phoenix Suns came from. There's talent out there. You're talking Devin Booker. You're talking them adding Chris Paul. But I don't know that many people expected the addition of Chris Paul to lead the Phoenix Suns to being the 2 seed in the West. You saw glimpses of what Phoenix could be last year in the bubble when they went 8-0 down in Orlando, but you still ended up coming just short from making the playoffs. Well, they decided to let the world know that the bubble Suns were not just an anomaly, and that the Phoenix Suns are now for real, as, like I said, they sit at the 2 spot out west. The Clippers come in at the 3 spot. I still think the Clippers are probably the best team in basketball right now. That's a hot take. Not many people would agree with me there, and that's fine. The question is, much like the New York Knicks, the Clippers organization has just been a franchise that has been plagued with futility over the years. As you lost, I think it was in the second round last year, when you should have easily made the conference finals and potentially made a run into the finals, and instead you get knocked out in a Game 7. So with the Clippers, the question is not the talent. You're talking Paul George, you're talking Kawhi Leonard, you're talking a team that is absolutely one of the top 3 or 4, at least, talented teams in the NBA. The question is whether or not the franchise as a whole can actually get over that hurdle that has been in the way for decades now. The Denver Nuggets sitting at 4. Denver's another one of those teams that they're quiet. It's not a huge market. They don't get all that much attention, but they continue to do what they do. They play hard. They play scrappy. You're talking about the potential MVP winner this year in Nikola Jokic. So look for Denver to be a team that potentially shocks people when the postseason comes around. They've fallen on hard times as of late, but I don't think that's indicative of what you can expect to see from the Nuggets when it comes to the playoffs. I think the Nuggets are going to be fine in the postseason. They got a week and a half to get it together. If they can't flip the switch in a week and a half, then maybe they were a fraud team all along. And the Nuggets, I mean, they're another franchise kind of like the Utah Jazz that you consistently hang around, especially over the past 4 or 5 years, being a top 4 or 5 team out west. And then they can never quite get over that hurdle. They can never quite make that leap. We'll just have to see whether this is the year for them or not. I don't really know that I believe it is, as I think outside of Nikolai Jokic, you're in a situation where I don't know that that roster is talented enough to actually get them to the Western Conference Finals, if it's actually good enough to get them to make a run to the finals. I just don't think that's a thing. Luka Doncic and the Dallas Mavericks sitting at 5. That's a team that I think is potentially the biggest sleeper in the Western Conference. I mentioned it with the Boston Celtics out east, and I think the Dallas Mavericks fall into that category when it comes to the Western Conference. You're talking about the guy who may be the best point guard in basketball right now in Luka Doncic. You're talking about a franchise that has had success over the years. They've won a couple of titles. Now, clearly, the talent level isn't the same. Clearly, the players are not the same. But nonetheless, they've been hanging around, much like the Denver Nuggets. You've been hanging around the 5, 6, 7 spot every year out west. And I think this is a year that they haven't received enough attention because you started off the year so bad. And it wasn't until game 15 to 20 that the Mavericks finally flipped the script and decided to start playing really good basketball. And since then, they've managed to climb to the 5th spot in the West. And I think they have the talent to knock off Denver. And then when it comes to a potential Dallas-Utah second round, Utah better watch out. Luka Doncic has shown that he is a baller. Luka Doncic has shown that he is a winner. He can make plays when it comes down, when games come down to the stretch. And I wouldn't be surprised if Dallas finds themselves sitting in the Western Conference Finals coming up next month. The biggest surprise out west right now, the Los Angeles Lakers, sitting at the 6 and currently tied with Portland, who is at 7. The Lakers have the tiebreaker there. That's why LeBron, to a major degree, came out ripping the play-in tournament. I believe it was earlier this week that LeBron basically came out and said whoever designed that needs to be fired. LeBron is not a fan because currently the Lakers are having questions in regards to their health. LeBron has missed weeks now, right at a month, I believe, with an injury. He came back and potentially re-aggravated the injury, so he's out this weekend again. The question with the Lakers is not the talent level. The question is simply the health level. If the Lakers can manage to get back healthy again, I think they're going to be fine. I just don't know that I like the odds of them actually getting back 100% healthy, which I think is going to be a problem moving forward for them. 7 is Portland. Portland's there every year. They underperform, seems like every year, even though Damian Lillard may be one of the most clutch players in the NBA. Golden State sitting at 8. That's a team to watch out for. You're still talking Steph Curry, even though Klay Thompson isn't there. Klay Thompson is hurt and is out for the year. You still have Steph. You still have Draymond. And if you let Golden State in, they are a team who can make noise. Now, clearly, they would be playing Portland in the play-in tournament, and I think that's going to raise some amount of questions, but I think that will be okay moving forward. The Grizzlies sitting at 9. I just don't think the Grizzlies are there yet. Ja Morant is a budding superstar, but the Grizzlies are not there quite yet. The Spurs sitting at 10. The Spurs have kind of crept their way in, but I don't think the talent level is there yet either. So I don't think the Western Conference is going to be quite as exciting. I think you are going to end up with Portland at the 7 and Golden State at the 8. So that's where we are with the Western Conference, the NBA playoff picture. And with that, coming up in the next segment, we have like I said earlier, a pretty obscure topic, if you will, in regards to sports. as we're going to talk about the NCAA and I guess you could call it criticism that they're facing surrounding some of their guidelines on their spring championships that are coming up in the next week to 2 to 3 weeks, depending on whether you're talking about softball or baseball. So that's where we are, and that's what we will be breaking down in the next segment, as well as ending the show today by me breaking down and ranking the 10 quarterbacks that were drafted in the 2021 NFL Draft.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
And now I want to welcome y'all back. So in the last segment, we broke down the NBA playoff picture, both the Eastern and the Western Conference, what we were looking at as we wind down the NBA regular season, as well as looking at what the play-in tournament could look like for the NBA coming up in the next week and a half to 2 weeks. Now I want to switch gears just a little bit and start talking about college baseball. So the NBA raised some eyebrows. I think it was in early April when they announced that they were going to set up predetermined hosting sites for the NCAA baseball and softball tournaments. For those of you who don't know how the baseball and softball tournaments work, it starts out with a field of 64 teams, and there are 16 hosting sites, and each hosting site holds 4 teams, and those are your 16 regionals. Well, the winner of each of those 16 then go on to play in a super regional, which is then hosted by another hosting site. Well, the NCAA, normally it ends up being on Memorial Day. Is that Monday ends up being Selection Monday for their baseball tournament, where they announce the teams, they announce the 16 hosting regionals. Well, this year, due to COVID, due to all of the ongoing protocols, they announced early on that they were going to have predetermined hosting sites for their regionals and their super regionals. What I don't think the NCAA really bargained for was some of the backlash that they were going to face when they made that announcement. And the reason I say that is that the NCAA, when you look at it, they had originally announced that by May 11th, they were going to have their 16 sites basically set in stone. Well, then last week, they came out and announced that instead of just going straight with the 16, they were going to announce a field of 20 potential hosting sites. And out of those 20, they would come back later on next week and announce the final 16 that we're going to end up hosting. Well, where we are is the NCAA has now apparently decided to delay the release of the 20 potential sites due to the fact that they have to be approved by the oversight committee. I don't really know why the NCAA needs to delay this information, in the sense of, if you're the NCAA here, where you're at is that you have these 20 sites that should already be predetermined. Why do you need approval from the oversight committee or anyone else for these 20 predetermined sites? And then coming up in the next week, it was supposed to be you announcing the final 16, where the way it normally works is that your 16 hosting regional sites are typically basically your 16 top seeds. That's the way it generally works out. Well, this year things could change due to COVID, due to certain restrictions that are out there state by state. So the reason this is so weird is that the NCAA is now delaying their own decision. And it's hard not to think that it's due to somewhat of the criticism that is being brought onto them by the idea of them trying to predetermine sites. There are a lot of people who aren't really happy about that. And the other issue that the NCAA is facing right now is that, along with their predetermining of the regional and super regional sites, they are now also putting a 50% attendance capacity on every site, as well as the College World Series that takes place in Omaha, Nebraska, and for the softball College World Series, which takes place in Oklahoma City. There are a lot of people who are a little upset by that. And the reason for that is that when you look at part of the country right now and the fact that we have differing, let's call it restrictions that are out there surrounding the coronavirus, where you have certain states that are opening up quicker than others are. Look at, for instance, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, and Texas. Those are all states that are opened up basically at full capacity right now. And then you have other states like California, New York, Michigan, and these places that are still facing restrictions on crowd gatherings. And the reason that a lot of people are coming and basically trying to criticize the NCAA for this is that with this 50% capacity that the NCAA has basically announced they're going to place on every different regional hosting site, that you're cutting revenue away from certain schools. And the reason I say that is I'm going to read off let's go with the top 15 right now. Or just for the sake, since there are 16 hosting sites, I'm going to go ahead and read off the top 16 teams in America in college baseball. This is all according to D1 Baseball, which is honestly the premier college baseball site that you can find. So the top 16 according to D1 Baseball right now: Arkansas is sitting at 1, Vanderbilt is at 2, TCU 3, Mississippi State 4, Tennessee 5, Texas 6, Notre Dame 7, Texas Tech 8, Arizona 9, Florida 10, Oregon 11, Ole Miss 12, East Carolina 13, Louisiana Tech 14, Louisville 15, Stanford 16. Those are your 16 current top seeds, if you will, according to D1 Baseball. The reason the cap that the NCAA has put on all of this is making news right now is that when you look at it, the state of Mississippi, which currently has 2 of the top 16 teams in Mississippi State and Ole Miss, as well as the state of Arkansas, as well as the state of Florida. Louisiana announced, I believe it was roughly 2 weeks ago, that they were opening up all of their events to 100% capacity. That you're talking, Governor Bill Lee in Tennessee, my bad, has come out and announced that he wants full capacity stadiums in his home state of Tennessee. The reason this is newsworthy is that roughly half or more of your what would end up being hosting sites in regards to the college baseball NCAA tournament right now are sitting at virtually full capacity stadiums. So the NCAA is facing grief because what they have announced with their 50% capacity limit that they're trying to put a cap on the NCAA tournament is that you're cutting away revenue and potential profits from these universities and these colleges. And that's where a lot of people are upset right now. Now, to be fair, I understand where the NCAA is coming from, as the NCAA is simply trying to bring in safety to the equation and basically say, hey, we still have a pandemic going on. We need to basically try to provide the safest conditions possible that we can, and that we don't want to do that in front of no fans, but that we feel 50% or so may be a logical conclusion for that. I certainly understand that, and I'm okay with that. The problem is that when you look at certain teams right now who have been playing in front of 100% capacity stadiums, Ole Miss has been playing in front of roughly 11,000 people week in and week out down at Swayze Field in Oxford. Mississippi State has been playing in front of close to 13,000 week in and week out down at Dudy Noble in Starkville, Mississippi. If you then try to come in and put a cap on what they can allow, assuming both of those schools were to host regionals, you have then cut what they are making in half. And absolutely and understandably, I think from the school's standpoint, you can understand why they would be somewhat upset by that. So this is a tight-knit situation that is, there really is no winning conclusion here. That the schools are looking out for themselves, saying, hey, we're now going to lose revenue with your 50% cap on attendance, whereas the NCAA is simply looking at it from a safety standpoint. So there are certain aspects that you look at on both sides and say you can absolutely understand where both sides are coming from. And I think part of the other issue is looking at it, if you're the NCAA, you're trying to protect, I don't know if fairness would be the correct word here that the NCAA is looking out for, but I don't think it's actually that far off in regards to what they're trying to do. That basically what the NCAA is trying to do is say, hey, right now with the differing situations that we see state by state regarding coronavirus mandates, restrictions, and everything else, that the NCAA is basically saying, hey, we don't want certain teams to have to travel to the state of Mississippi, the state of Florida, potentially the state of Texas. TCU is sitting at, I think it's 3 right now in the D1 baseball polls, and play in front of potentially 10, 11, 12,000 people, whereas if you're a team who ends up having to travel out to Palo Alto, out in California, where Stanford could potentially be looking at hosting a regional, and them having a extremely strict capacity limit where the California government may not even allow 50% out at a California sporting event. I'm not exactly sure what their restrictions are right now surrounding the coronavirus. But if you're traveling out to Stanford to play in a regional, suddenly you're only playing in front of 2,000 or 3,000 people, whereas you have other teams who are playing in front of 12. And I think the NCAA is looking at that saying, let's just do our best to kind of limit the two spectrums, if you will, there. So I understand where the NCAA is coming from. The other thing to keep in mind here is, let's don't think for a second that these schools are going to sit back idly by, if you will. These schools are going to try to protect themselves. So while the NCAA has come out and put a cap on what you're looking at, and like I said, I think that's understandable, these schools are also looking out for themselves. I know, me being from North Mississippi, I know that the capacity right now at Swayze Field down in Oxford sits somewhere around the 12,000 mark. Down at Dudy Noble in Starkville, Mississippi with Mississippi State, their capacity is somewhere around the 13,500 mark, I believe. So where you're at is that if the NCAA comes in and puts that cap on, call it those two stadiums, suddenly you're looking at 6,000 and right at 7,000 for Mississippi State. You're going to end up in a situation where these individual schools, these individual universities are basically going to cook their books to a degree and try to up that capacity. I've been to Swayze Field down in Oxford multiple times. I've been to Dudy Noble a couple of times. There is room out, especially in Oxford, that you can bring in basically metal bleachers to up the capacity limit if that's what the NCAA is going to make them do. And having been a student at Ole Miss, having gone to school down there, having been down there multiple times, I can tell you that that's absolutely something Ole Miss would do. So these universities are not going to be willing to sit idly by while the NCAA puts this cap on things. These universities, especially a lot of them anyway, down south, down in the SEC country, where you're dealing with Florida, you're dealing with Ole Miss, Mississippi State, Tennessee is on track to host, Vandy is absolutely going to host, Arkansas is going to host. All of these different schools, they're going to be looking out for their best interest while the NCAA is looking out for theirs as well. It's all going to come to a head, and I don't know what the answer is going to be. I tend to believe that the NCAA certainly isn't going to fold here, that these universities, they can throw things together and they can put all kinds of pressure that they want to on the NCAA, but this doesn't really seem like a topic or a competition, a category, if you will, that the NCAA is willing to break on, that the NCAA is willing to fold on. And I think what you've seen, for those of you who don't know, Vanderbilt just played a series a couple weeks ago over in Knoxville against Tennessee. After that series, the Vanderbilt head coach, Tim Corbin, came out and blasted the city of Nashville and Vanderbilt University for their restrictions on capacity on attendance, as Tennessee had more people at that series than Vandy had had at theirs all year long. The next week, Vanderbilt announced that they were going to up their capacity limit just a little bit. So that's where we are. Along those same lines, this past weekend, the head coach over at Louisville, at the University of Louisville, came out with the same argument that Tim Corbin made, that basically saying they were tired of playing in front of no fans. And literally the next day, the University of Louisville upped their attendance limit, their attendance cap, and they placed it at, I think it's 50% now, up at the University of Louisville. So I think where you're at right now is you're seeing managers, you're seeing players without directly coming at the NCAA, without directly coming at their universities. They're trying to get these limits and these caps upped. You're trying to end up with more fans in attendance. And like I said, if you're a manager, if you're a player, you have to understand that. Now, does that go against certain safety guidelines? You could absolutely say yes. And you can understand that argument as well. Like I said, you can understand where the NCAA is coming from. But if you're a player, if you're a manager, clearly you want people there to see your product. And that's the reason I say this is an interesting topic that is kind of going under the radar right now, that I think is going to end up coming to a massive head as we enter into postseason play in regards to baseball, but as well as softball. I didn't break down these softball rankings, but these softball rankings are looking extremely similar as well. So that's where we are with the NCAA and the fact that that is going to end up being a pretty big story that I think is going underreported right now. Now, coming up in the next segment, as promised, I'm here to deliver on promises. I'm going to be breaking down the 10 quarterbacks that were taken in the 2021 NFL Draft, breaking down not only talent level, but fit with where they ended up in regards to their respective teams.
Are you looking for help for your fantasy football team? Check out the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Get today's best advice on who to start, who to sit, even who you should draft. From sleeper picks to red-hot lineups, they got it all covered for you. That's gsmcpodcast.com/fantasy-football-podcast. We'll cover traditional leagues, dynasty, PPR, even IDP leagues. When you need fantasy help, there's just one show to hit up. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Back in. So in the third segment, we broke down the questions and the somewhat criticism, if you will, that the NCAA is facing surrounding some of their requirements, restrictions, and mandates that they are trying to put on their spring championships. And with that out of the way, now I want to, as promised, bring y'all the top 10 list of the 10 quarterbacks that were drafted in the 2021 NFL Draft. Anyone that follows football knows that in regards to the NFL especially, the quarterback is the most important position on the field. I don't really think that's a controversial statement at all. Most people would agree with that, if not virtually everyone would agree with that. So that's the reason when you look at it and you see that 10 quarterbacks were taken in the 2021 NFL Draft that occurred and took place last weekend, I felt like it was important to go ahead and dive into a top 10 list. Now, keep in mind, this list is no one else's. It's mine. If anyone else that you've listened to has this same list, I would encourage you to question them and wonder why they're copying me. But hey, that's just me though. So now I want to go ahead and dive into my list. So at number 10, I have Ian Book going to the New Orleans Saints. Ian Book is the quarterback that has played at Notre Dame over the past couple of years, got drafted by the New Orleans Saints. I'm just not a huge fan of this pick if I'm the Saints here. I don't think Ian Book has a real future as an NFL quarterback. And when you look at it, when you look at his skill set, he seems more of a almost tight end type. The problem is, by going to the New Orleans Saints, you're in a situation where Jameis Winston is your quarterback. And if Jameis Winston isn't going to be the quarterback, then Taysom Hill is going to be the quarterback. Taysom Hill has spent the past couple of years in that same exact role that I would promise you they're trying to mold Ian Book into, as being a bit of an all-purpose guy. That's what Taysom Hill has been in the NFL. He was a pretty good quarterback over at BYU, and now in that role in New Orleans, he's played well as an all-purpose guy. Maybe he ends up being the guy, but the problem is I just question where the fit is with Ian Book. So that's the reason he comes in at last on my list in regards to the quarterbacks that were taken in the 2021 NFL Draft. At number 9, I have Kellen Mond. Kellen Mond got drafted by the Minnesota Vikings, and Kellen Mond, coming out of Texas A&M, he has been extremely good at times. And then there have been other times that you just kind of scratch your head and say, what was going on there? And that's the reason I feel like the inconsistency surrounding Kellen Mond is the reason that he fell on my list. He was, I believe it was the 6th quarterback taken overall, and he comes in at number 9 on my list. And the questions that I have with Kellen Mond are not whether he can play quarterback. He can absolutely play quarterback at the next level. The question is whether or not the consistency can be there at a high enough level to bring him to be a starter in the NFL. I have my doubts. I have my questions there. Maybe he proves me wrong. But right now, when you look at what he did at Texas A&M, he had a good career, but it certainly wasn't great. I think in regards to expectations, he underperformed just a little bit, which ended up dropping him here on my list. At number 8, I have Sam Ehlinger being drafted by the Indianapolis Colts. This is a move similar to Ian Book on my list, except I think Sam Ehlinger is a better fit to be that all-purpose kind of guy. I don't think we need to be confused by the idea that Sam Ehlinger is going to end up being a quarterback in the NFL at the next level. I don't really think he has a future there. The problem is that Sam Ehlinger's build, Sam Ehlinger's body type is a magnificent fit for bringing him into a Taysom Hill type role, except up in Indianapolis as opposed to being down in New Orleans where Taysom Hill is. So I think with the right training, I could imagine Sam Ehlinger ending up switching, giving up on the idea of being an NFL quarterback and deciding to switch more toward an all-purpose, potentially a tight end / slot back role. Number 7 on my list. This is going to surprise a lot of people. I have Trey Lance. Trey Lance went 3rd overall to the San Francisco 49ers. The problem that I have with Trey Lance is that you're dealing with a small sample size. The guy only started 17 games in college at North Dakota State. We're not talking him starting games in the SEC, him starting games, a small number of games in the Big Ten. We're discussing him starting a small number of games at the FCS level instead of the FBS level. And for those of you who don't know, North Dakota State is primarily a rushing attack. They don't throw the ball all that much. They got knocked out of the FCS playoffs last weekend in the quarterfinals. It ended a streak of 8 consecutive years of them appearing in the semifinals. The reason I bring this up is that in the first round of the FCS playoffs this year, they ran for over 400 yards of offense against Monmouth. We're not discussing a high-flying offense here by any means by the Bison up in North Dakota State. So when I'm looking at my rankings, I'm looking at a quarterback who hasn't really played top-notch competition. To wit, he played in one game last fall. North Dakota State played Central Arkansas, and Trey Lance threw for less than 150 yards of offense. Justin Fields, who was also available with the 3 pick that San Francisco could have taken, threw for 300 and I think it was 87 yards against Clemson in an FBS semifinal game that led his team to the national title game. Justin Fields threw for just under 400 yards of offense against one of the best defenses in America. Trey Lance threw for under 150 yards of offense against Central Arkansas. Trey Lance may have the highest ceiling of any quarterback out there right now, but in regards to what he has shown me and what I could expect to see in the NFL, I just question this move by the San Francisco 49ers, so I'm not a huge believer in that pick, especially at number 3. I would have leaned more toward Mac Jones or Justin Fields there, but hey, I'm not here to question NFL GMs and decisions that they make. At number 6, I have Davis Mills. He's the quarterback out of Stanford, got drafted by the Houston Texans, and I think this is a name that is going way too under the radar. With the Houston Texans in a bit of a bind regarding Deshaun Watson and his sexual assault, sexual harassment allegations, I think you're in a situation where Deshaun Watson is looking at probably being out for at least the 2021 season due to suspension. So the Houston Texans need a quarterback on their roster. And I think Davis Mills is a good pickup. They got him in the middle rounds of the draft this year, and he is a guy who was highly touted coming out of high school. And the problem is he got hurt while he was at Stanford. When he was on the field, Stanford played well, and he especially played well. So I think Davis Mills has the potential to be the under-the-radar guy in this year's draft class that could raise some eyebrows in year 1 if he gets the chance to play. And if not year 1, then year 2, year 3 down the road, I think he is absolutely going to become a household name. At 5, I have Kyle Trask being drafted by the Buccaneers with the last pick of the second round. Kyle Trask, I don't know that he's NFL ready right now. The good thing about him being drafted by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers is that he is going to be able to learn behind arguably the greatest quarterback of all time in Tom Brady. I think Tom Brady is going to play at least 1 more year, probably 2 more years, which gives Kyle Trask plenty of time to develop, become a smarter quarterback, a better quarterback. And like I said, when you're learning behind the greatest, there really isn't a downside to that. Yes, is he sacrificing a bit of playing time on the front end? Sure. But I think that sacrifice is going to end up paying off on the back end. So I think that's the reason I like Kyle Trask. You're walking into a situation where Tampa Bay, if they keep all of their weapons, they are still going to be a Super Bowl caliber team this year, as well as moving forward. So I really like this pickup by Tampa Bay with the fact that they managed to get him with the last pick in the first round. Number 4, I have Zach Wilson going to the New York Jets. The Jets traded away Sam Darnold, who they took in the first round, I think it was 2 years ago, and now they just drafted Zach Wilson, number 2 overall. Zach Wilson is one of those hit or miss guys. He played at BYU in college. You showed glimpses of you being phenomenal. And then you had other moments where you just questioned what it is that he was doing out on the field. Zach Wilson, I don't know that he's NFL ready right now. The athleticism is there. You saw that plenty while he was at BYU, but I don't know if the decision making is there right now. I would lean a little toward the accuracy. I'm not sure if the accuracy is there for Zach Wilson right now. That remains to be seen. I do like the fact that the Jets have clearly decided that they want to surround their quarterback with weapons now. That's one thing that was lacking when they had Sam Darnold as their quarterback. It honestly infuriated me with the lack of weapons that they gave Sam Darnold. They at least seem to have recognized their mistake, and they are in the process of trying to remedy that mistake, as they drafted Elijah Moore out of Ole Miss in the second round this year. Elijah Moore, I know I talked about him in the first segment today. He's a deep threat guy. He has the ability, he has the speed, he has the hands to spread the defense just a little bit. So I like this fit a lot, with the fact that the Jets clearly seem to be buying in now more toward giving their potential franchise quarterback in Zach Wilson a few weapons that will certainly help him out in the long run. At number 3, I have Justin Fields, coming out of the Ohio State University. Justin Fields is a guy who has faced a lot of question marks in this whole draft process. There are a lot of people who think you were the second best quarterback in the draft. There are a lot of people who thought he was roughly the 5th to 6th best quarterback in the draft. It just depends on who you listen to. Justin Fields started his career at Georgia, ended up leaving Georgia, transferred to Ohio State, and proceeded to lead Ohio State to the national title game. Justin Fields is a warrior. He is strong. He is tough. It hasn't been announced, but I would certainly lean toward the idea, for those of you who paid attention, I think Justin Fields played the national title game with broken ribs that he suffered against Clemson. The guy is a warrior. The guy is tough. The question I have with Justin Fields is, can he perform if he is facing a blitz? If he is being pressured, does he have the accuracy that he can stand back in the pocket and deliver on a 3rd and 7, a 3rd and 8, which is what the NFL is? And that's one of those questions that he is going to have to prove to me. So the mobility is there. I think the decision-making is decent on his part. The question that I have with Justin Fields is the accuracy, and that's the reason I dropped him just a little bit on my list. Number 2, I have Trevor Lawrence. I think Trevor Lawrence is the best quarterback in the class. There's a reason he went number 1 overall. Urban Meyer, the new head coach over in Jacksonville, is in his first stint in the NFL. He's trying to prove himself at the NFL level now. He's won multiple national titles in college at Florida and Ohio State, and now he's trying to prove himself at the next level. I think him with Trevor Lawrence, it's going to be a unique fit, and I think he's going to succeed. I think they're both going to succeed. The question with Trevor Lawrence has always been decision-making. The accuracy is there. The athleticism is there. The arm strength is there. The problem is he's a Brett Favre type in the sense that he's a gunslinger. He thinks he can make every throw, and that led him to some trouble while he was at Clemson, especially this past year. So if he plays up to his ceiling, if he plays up to his potential, Trevor Lawrence is going to be the best quarterback in this draft. I don't think that's a question. The question is whether or not he can play up to that level. So that's where we are with Trevor Lawrence. And that leaves us with number 1. I have Mac Jones on my list. I think Mac Jones is roughly the 3rd or 4th best quarterback on this list that was drafted in terms of talent. The problem is fit. The fact that the NFL allowed Mac Jones to drop down to 15 and get drafted by Bill Belichick and the New England Patriots should concern a lot of people. Mac Jones has a lot of similarities to Tom Brady, who, like we said, has become arguably the best quarterback in NFL history. The decision-making is similar. I don't know that Mac Jones has quite the arm strength, but I think he has slightly more mobility than Tom Brady did. So when you put him into the Bill Belichick system that allowed, at least to a degree, Tom Brady to be successful to the tune of, I think it was 6 Super Bowl rings, with even a decent amount of talent surrounding him, Mac Jones has the ability to be the next Tom Brady. I think the ceiling is there for Mac Jones to be at that caliber. Now, I think it's more likely that he ends up a middle-of-the-pack guy, maybe slightly above average, but that doesn't change the fact that the ceiling, when you look at Mac Jones, when you look at the accuracy, the decision-making, along with the system that he's going to be in up in Foxborough with Bill Belichick, I think Mac Jones has the easiest road out of all of these quarterbacks. That's the reason I have him at number 1 on my list of quarterbacks drafted here in the NFL draft that just took place last weekend. That's the show for today. I hope all of you guys enjoyed. Thank you guys for listening to the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. Now, with this out of the way, I would like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show, write a nice review that really helps us. Also, feel free to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all of the social media networks that you may be on. And I can't wait to see you guys next time. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.